Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Seforim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by R Moshe Maimon. I think this is the fifth time. And this time we're going to be discussing his own work. Once again, we actually discussed this a while ago about Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam. But we realized we've had him on a number of times now, but we discussed that time, the Rambam and Rambam, which he did on, by now it's Pirush Shemais. So those are two volumes, one on Bereshis, one on Shemais, and then there's a volume on the small volume on the Ma'amar Al HaAggados, which is what we discussed previously, and we discussed a little bit about the Rambam and the Chumash, but we didn't discuss enough about it, and that was like a 30-something minute episode. It was in the beginning of the podcast, and this is time to discuss. I've had you now on a bunch of times on the podcast. I think this is time. The time has come to properly discuss the Rambam and Rambam, and now at this time it was complete. I think at that time you hadn't published Shemais. So with that introduction, thank you very much for coming on and joining me once again.
Thank you very much, Nachi. Thanks again for kicking off the project. And like I say, it's always a great pleasure to be on your podcast. And at the same time, I do beg your listeners' indulgence if we do cover some of the same things we covered in that short episode. We'll do it again now in a little fuller, and hopefully we'll be able to spice with enough new material that it won't get on anyone's nerves.
Right, I forgot to add that we may cover some of the similar things, but like I said, that was over 2 years ago. It was a while ago, and hopefully we do a better job here than we did on that episode. So, okay, let's start off with Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam. But before we even get to, what drew you to Rabeinu Ben HaRambam? This you probably have mentioned. Your name is Maimon. You're a descendant of the Rambam. What's your shaykhs? Why did you decide to work on Rabeinu Ben HaRambam?
Yeah, well, that is how it started. It started due to, I felt as a young kid, I felt there's a family connection here. This is our legacy. I carry his name, the family name. I should try to get acquainted with him. The Murder was obviously way beyond reach. Some of Mishnah Torah I did learn, and I figured, something on Chumash. I like Chumash a lot. Let's try the Pirush on Chumash. And, I didn't understand a lot of it at first, but the more times, the more you keep going back to the well and you start appreciating the nuance and his particular approach, which we're going to get into later. It's quite a unique approach, and it kind of grows on you. And that's, I was just totally sucked into his world and his way of looking at the world, and his approach to Chumash, his approach to Pshat, his approach to halacha, and everything is just, it was refreshingly unique, original, sensitive, meaningful. And we're going to touch on all these qualities in the course of this episode, I hope. But once it became a passion for life, and I couldn't get out of it.
So, but when and kind of why did you decide I'm going to edit his writings and put them out now, which is each of the volumes on Chumash are, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen them, big fat volumes. I think they're a few hundred pages, 600-700 pages. And the one I got it's small, but there's a lot. You did a lot there. So when did you decide, okay, I'm going to do this?
This plan, it progressed. As I was appreciating learning it and enjoying it, and I'd be scribbling notes in the margins and trying to figure it out. And it was on the one hand rewarding to be able to understand it, but at the same time frustrating that it was just so cumbersome and so hard to get to the bottom of what he was doing. And the print was bad, and the syntax is hard to understand, and the presentation without paragraphs and sentences, and it was just very difficult to use. So it was, it started nagging me that such a wonderful sefer is not more readily accessible physically, that people can go and buy it. It was already becoming rare and hard to find, and B, that it's just hard to learn because of the way it's presented. So I started dreaming of an idea that maybe I should reprint it, just with a nice new layout, nice new typography, and without getting too much into it. And I actually decided one Rosh Hashanah, I made a New Year's resolution that, yes, so this is the year I should work on that. I'm not anyone that can, write too many notes on it, but I didn't plan on writing notes on it. I was just going to have it retypeset and published nicely. At the time, there was no digital version available. So I copied all the pages, I OCR'd them, and then I looked against the original and corrected them by hand, added in all the psukim. I did all this by hand. A short while later, a digital version became available, and there was a little twinge of regret that maybe I should have waited and saved myself a lot of trouble. But on the other hand, just the going through it over and over again and typing and reading and putting in the psukim and seeing where they belong, and that it gave me a whole new dimension, a whole new familiarity with some of the more subtle, aspects of the pirush, which maybe don't jump out at you at first, but as you're, looking at it carefully, you're picking up a lot of gems. And so it really was a very, very worthwhile experience. That was in the initial stages. And then as I was learning more about it and appreciating more about it, I would add some notes. I can explain it according to this. I can explain it according to that. At the same time, I would be going through all of the Rashis, Rambans, Ibn Ezra's, Seforim, all the Mefarshim and the Ma'amar Al HaAggados, and making a comparative study, especially the Rambam. I would look up any relevant Rambam. I would search it. I had some of the, the Rambam, there's collections of Rambam Al HaTorah, various different editions. I would use those. I was using all the, aids that I could. And together I was drawing on, the background needed to understand the context of Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam. And I was writing these notes. Again, it wasn't that major, and I had thought, all right, I'll add some notes, and it would be a nice volume, not too hefty, not too big, still one volume. But after a couple years, I was advised by my friends that you're in this deep already. It makes sense to really do they didn't use the term critical edition, but do a good job and get into every pasuk and explain every single thing, what he's coming to answer and why. And so when I added that dimension, now I started learning the sources that Rabeinu Avraham himself learned. Instead of doing a comparative study of what it means to me, holding him against the other Mefarshim and the Ma'amar Al HaAggados, I started looking, what did he learn? He used Reb Sadia going. So I went through the Targum of Reb Sadia, which is available. Reb Sadia wrote two Pirushim. We'll get into Reb Sadia's approach a little bit later, but I would use Reb Sadia, I would use Reb Shmuel ben Chafni. Now I would place more of an emphasis on Ibn Ezra, because these are the sources that he quotes a lot, and I would add that now. So, not just a comparative study, but also understanding where he's coming from and the way he's learning and the approach. So it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then as I thought I was finishing that phase, then Professor Friedman, who I'd been in contact with over the years, for help in specific, Arabic words and phrases to help me work with those, he suggests, he said, you're in this enough. At this point, you should really start taking achrayas for the translation as well, and you should, go through the translation and revise it as necessary. So I delayed the project for another few years while I worked on that angle, and at this point, it had metastasized into two big volumes. And again, I'm sorry that there may be those that don't like the format, but this is the all-out experience. You get the entire 7 years worth of research and learning for producing this pirush.
Okay, so you mentioned the translation. We'll discuss more. We should mention originally it was written in Arabic. So this is like a lot of Rishonim did at the Tkufa. They wrote in Arabic. The Rambam did a lot of his Seforim, not all, but a lot of his Seforim in Arabic as well. And this has been translated. Okay, let's move away just a little bit from the actual pirush, and let's move to Avraham himself. For those not familiar, I think we did discuss this a while ago, but it's a while ago. We should, rediscuss this. Maybe we'll discuss something new. So Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam, we know who his father was the Rambam, but talk about a little bit, when was he born, where was he born, and his early parts of his life.
Yeah, Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam was born to his father in the year 1186 in Cairo. Now, to understand where the Rambam was at this point, you have to understand the Rambam was born in Cordoba in Spain. The Rambam was part of the rich intellectual Andalusian Jewry, but he was from the rabbinical branch of that Jewry. The intellects were all men of letters, and they would write poetry, and they would write works on grammar and language. Of course, they studied Chumash and the Gemara, to some degree, but it was with an intellectual bent. Whereas the rabbis would focus more on the Gemara and the Chumash, of course, more on the sources, more on the halacha, but informed, of course, with an appreciation of letters as well. So that's why in the Rambam's own works, you see a familiarity with diktuk and a familiarity with shira and piyut and poetry, but not a big emphasis, and in fact even disdains those who placed too great an emphasis on it, because familiarity is one thing, but to him the ikr was, of course, harmonizing the Torah with reason and getting to the bottom of it, establishing a clear halachic precedent for everything, and mastering the Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat Peh. That was by him the Iker. And the Rambam himself worked in these fields. His first work was the Pirush Al Mishnayos, which he started in Spain. He finished along the journey when he was forced out of Spain from the persecutions of the radical fanatical Almohads, and he had to leave Spain, went to Morocco, stopped off in Israel, eventually settling in Egypt. At which time, about that time, is when he completed the Pirush Al Mishnayos. Then he embarked, while a young rabbi in Egypt, still not the head of the community, but a prominent person in the community. He started working on his Mishnah Torah. He still had time. He was still being supported by his brother, his younger brother, who was a successful businessman. So he had time to devote to his Mishnah Torah and his learning. And we don't know much about his family life at the time either. He was married and his wife had passed away, or he only got married later. We don't know. But it's only later, about the time when he finishes writing the Mishnah Torah, that he has his son, who, as far as we know, and it appears from the Geniza documents that this is the case, he has his only son. He may have had daughters as well, but his only son, Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam. And about the same time that he finishes writing the Mishnah Torah, tragedy strikes, and he loses his brother. And his brother, who like we said, was a businessman, would travel the route to China and India and bring back merchandise. And it was a very precarious position because boats were often lost at sea. And eventually Reb David himself suffered that fate. The younger brother of the Rambam, who the Rambam says was like a son to him. And it shook his world. First of all, he fell into depression for a long time, he writes. And now he became responsible for Reb David's family. Reb David, in addition to being his supporter, was like a family member, like his son, he says. And therefore, that was a big upheaval in the Rambam's life. He was forced now to earn a living, which he did by becoming the physician in the Sultan's court. And on top of that, this is when he started, when he went away from the Mishnah Torah, he finished the Mishnah Torah, he probably had less time now for his personal study, and the remaining literary creativity that he had, he devoted to writing the Moreh Nevuchim, answering questions, of course, although his day was very, very occupied now with work as in the Sultan's court, and as well as communal responsibilities that he had to take on. It was at this time that Rabeinu Avraham was born into this very, very busy life of the Rambam. Now, Rabeinu Avraham, the son, was trained by his father. His father, we have evidence that his father would let him sit in on meetings with important people while he was still a young child. There's Geniza evidence, accounts of people who come to visit the Rambam and converse with the son who was there. He himself talks about learning in the yeshiva with the other Talmidim and the Rambam's interaction with other Talmidim. So he gets all his training now from the Rambam. So part of that training includes philosophy, which is the basis of the Moreh Nevuchim, but a very big part of it is learning the Mishnah Torah, learning the Rif, learning the Gemara, and also learning Chumash. And we know about learning the Chumash from the Pirush, where he quotes his father's opinion on a lot of these matters. So Rabeinu Avraham himself gets a very good training from the Rambam. He doesn't learn anywhere else, as far as we know. He just learns by the Rambam. And he gets to the point, and the Rambam talks with pride about his son while he was still, young, in his young teens, 14 or 15. The Rambam refers to him in a letter as somebody that was endowed with great intelligence and beautiful midas. And the Rambam reveals that he named his son Avraham after his own favorite hero, who's Avraham Avinu. That's what the Rambam writes. And Avraham, he says, my son Avraham is worthy of carrying the name of Avraham Avinu because he carries on his traditions perfectly. And he says, B'li Safek, I have no doubt that this son of mine will be one of the future greats of our nation. A short while later, the Rambam died when Rabeinu Avraham was only 19 years old, but the community concurred with the Rambam's assessment, and they asked him to assume his father's leadership role in the community. Eventually, there's even a title that's associated with that. We don't know that the Rambam carried this title, but the title that Rabeinu Avraham gets in this leadership role is the Nugid, the prince. That such a title was used in Baghdad for the communal leaders in Baghdad. Now the Egyptian community uses this title as well, and it's held. The first person to actually hold the title is Rabeinu Avraham, and all his children and descendants for the next 5 or 6 generations carry the same title as well. Rabeinu Avraham lived a short life, relatively speaking. He died in 1237. But during that time, assuming the leadership role at the age of 19, he also followed his father into the Sultan's court, where he served as one of the main physicians. We have an interesting account of him from, there's a Muslim historian who gives an account of all the physicians he met, and he describes Rabeinu Avraham in a few sentences as tall and slender, quiet but intelligent. He refers to him with very positive descriptions. So we know he made a very nice impression. He was the leader of his community. He had his own beis medrash in addition to running the communal affairs of the Egyptian community. He had his own beis medrash where he practiced some pietist practices. We can get into that in a little bit. But so he had an influence on his small group of followers as well as on the larger community. He would answer questions from as far away as Yemen. Yemen had a tradition of venerating the Rambam, which they continued with his son and further descendants. So he was busy with writing responses to them. He had a very good relationship with the rabbis of province who had passed through Egypt on their way to, the rabbis of province who come from the school of the Bali Taisvis. They met with him. They were very impressed with him. So they carried on a nice correspondence as well. We have some Hebrew shuvas that he wrote in Hebrew. Most of his writings were addressed to Judeo-Arabic speaking people, but he would write to these rabbis in Hebrew. So we have, we know he carried on an active correspondence with them as well. Tragically, he died young. It appears that it was some kind of pandemic which claimed his life at the young age of in his 50s. So it's but by that time he had already managed to leave over quite a considerable literary legacy, and he was venerated throughout the region by all those who knew him.
So you mentioned something there interesting. You mentioned his pietistic tendencies. I think some call him Rambam Chassid, right? I think
sure.
He's known as, so the Rambam is not known as a Chassid. The Rambam is a philosopher. So kind of two questions. These pietistic tendencies, how does this compare with the Rambam? Where did he get it from? And also philosophy. How does, the Rambam being the Nebuchim and philosophy and the philosopher, was a Rambam like that or not?
It's a good question. It's a good question because to the observer now, separated by 800 years or so, just reading their works, they do seem very divergent. It does seem the Rambam, where he does mention, the pietistic practices of what we know now as the Sufis, which is a Muslim pietistic sect. He refers to those who follow those practices as extremists. He denigrates it as it's necessary, maybe as a curative, an approach just for people who need it, but it's certainly not the ends. And people who make an ends out of it are foolish and they're wrong. So he doesn't mince words. He does not hold of it at all. Whereby Rabeinu Avraham not only speaks so laudatorily about these practices, but he implements a lot of them, and he advises people to follow them. So that's kind of hard to jive his opinion in that regard with the Rambam's writings. Now, it is very important to remember that the writings are not the whole man. And Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam himself, he certainly felt that he was entirely in consonance with his father's approach. He takes great pains to mention that all the time. Perhaps there's a different audience. The Rambam's audience may not have been Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam's audience. There may have been different trends, and they had to address and pivot and adjust to different norms. That's you have to bear that in mind. And also, there is an approach which does seek to harmonize, as much as possible. There's going to be some degree of difference, but that's natural. But there is also an approach that seeks to harmonize it as well. So it's a very good question. I'll give you an example. The Rambam's own interest in philosophy is very celebrated to this very day. The Rambam's Nebuchim is built on philosophy. And it would seem that the Rambam, what he writes about, he believes that part of philosophy is Ma'aseh Merkava, part of it is Ma'aseh Bereshis, the more scientific, what we call now science, which was included then in philosophy. That's Ma'aseh Bereshis according to the Rambam. So philosophy plays a very prominent role in the Rambam's thoughts. Now, how much of that Was the Rambam's, was it his personal shita? Was he brought up that way? Did he give it over to his kids? Well, we have a very interesting Geniza document, which was published, over 100 years ago. And it's, it's been forgotten, but it's now getting some more press. And this is written by who we now know as Rabeinu Avraham's father-in-law. Rabeinu Avraham's father-in-law, who was also part of this pietistic school, pietistic beis medrash, and he himself was a student of the Rambam. His name was Rabeinu Al Hadayan. He was, for a while, people, most people never heard of him, but people who did would confuse him with Rabeinu Hananel on the side of the Gemara. It's a different Rabeinu Hananel. This is Rabeinu Hananel Hadayan, then Rabeinu Hananel ben Shmuel. He was a Dayan in Egypt. He was a Dayan on the Rambam's Bezdin toward the end of the Rambam's life. And his daughter married Rabeinu Avraham. And he writes about Rabeinu HaAggados, which is how they refer to the Rambam. He's writing against, people, there were some students who felt they should follow the Rambam's example and immerse themselves in philosophy. And Rabeinu Hananel writes, philosophy is good, but don't go too far with philosophy. Even Rabeinu HaAggados, he said, that's not the training he got. We know his father, Rabeinu Maimon, was not overly immersed in philosophy, and that wasn't the Rambam's way. He himself was a genius. He was brilliant. Which, by the way, this puts to bed that story quoted. There's a story in Shalshelas HaKabbalah peddles the story, and it's quoted again in Seder HaDoros. So in some of the books, in some of the more popular children's books about the Rambam, you'll see the story about how the Rambam was really an ignoramus at a very young age, and his father was so frustrated with him, and then he devoted himself to learning, and miraculously he developed into the Rambam. But this document puts that to rest. No, because Rabeinu Hananel writes, he was a genius from birth. There was nothing he didn't learn. There was nothing he wasn't capable of. He knew he had to know everything. So he went philosophy, but that wasn't part of his upbringing. It wasn't part of his training. That wasn't the way he lived. And interestingly, there's a very, from on the other end, later, a few generations later, we have Rabbi Yosef ibn Kaspi, provincial rationalist from the extreme rationalists. He wrote Pirush ibn Kaspi, a Pirush on the Rambam, Pirush on Chumash, with ultra rationalistic tendencies to the point where some people would even consider him beyond the pale of orthodoxy. Be that as it may, Ibn Kaspi put his money where his mouth is, and he said, "I'm a student of the Rambam. I've got to go and study at the feet of the Maimonidean descendants who know the Rambam better than anyone." And in those days, it wasn't easy to travel from province to Egypt, but he undertook the journey. He got there, and he wrote about it in his, in his other Seforim. And he says, "I was terribly disappointed when I got there because I found that the Rambam." He met Rabeinu Avraham's son and grandson, and he writes, "I found that they're Shlishi, they're Vi, they're wonderful tzaddikim, they're great, holy, pious Jews, but they know very little chachma." And he was he wasted his time, totally wasted his time. And he calls it, he quotes a pasuk about people who go to Mitzrayim looking for salvation and don't find it. He was very upset. Now, it's interesting to us because Rabeinu Avraham talks very positively about philosophy where it's necessary. It's Pirushim and Chumash where it comes up. He'll mention them. One of them, I'll just throw out just to help give you an example about the kind of thing you'll find in the Pirush where it says that the Tzefardea died. He talks about, well, is a dead Tzefardea still called a Tzefardea? Or is it not? Because Hashem said he's going to remove the Tzefardea, but they only died, didn't get removed. So he quotes a philosophical concept which I examined. I found that this is it's a basic Aristotelian concept that a dead animal only bears the name in a very loosely borrowed way as that of a live animal, because they're two totally different things. Later scholars have mocked that. I know you have an interest in Italian Jewry. The Emunas Hachamim from Rabbi Vayad Sar Shalom Bazila, he criticizes, he laughs and scoffs at the idea. That's what actually alerted to me that, hey, that's the idea that Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam was talking about. And I did the research and found that. So, he'll draw on philosophical concepts as necessary. Of course, he quotes Moira and Nevuchim wherever possible. And of course, he considers it the Holy Grail. But again, there's not an overemphasis on philosophy. And the reason being because it's possible that the Rambam, despite all his interest in philosophy, understood that that's not for everybody. It's not the way he raised his kids. It's not the way he was raised. It's not the way he raised his kids. It's not the way he tried to influence the community. So that might have that might have an influence on the question at hand. Also about the pietistic tendencies of Rabeinu Avraham. He felt it's fully in consonance with the way he was brought up by the Rambam, and who knew better than him? So it's a complicated question with no easy answers.
Okay, so you mentioned Rabeinu Al Rambam's father-in-law. So we do have now a published commentary in Eruvin from Machon Ofek they publish from him. So
they have from him on Eruvin, they have from him on Kiddushin. There's a lot of Geniza fragments from him which are coming to light, but it was only about 50 years ago. They know him from the Geniza already for a long time before that, and even the Shem Hagdalah mentions him. His name had come up, and the Shem Hagdalah talks about people confusing with Rabeinu Chananel, but we did not know about the family connection until Goitain discovered it, and he published it in the Jubilee edition of the Tarbitz. He published a very seminal article on the subject, and we finally, and he even then he wasn't sure of it, but later scholars like Paul Fenton and others, they found even further evidence, and now it's beyond question. This is the Rambam's father-in-law. Rabeinu Avram's father-in-law.
Yeah. Now, just one more thing on their connection. Do we know who Rabeinu Avram's Rebbeim were? I guess I assume it was the Rambam. That was where he learned under, and maybe his father-in-law.
His father-in-law probably had some influence on him with this Derech HaChasidus, this Beis Medrash that Rabeinu Avram didn't found this Beis Medrash, but he did lead the Beis Medrash. There was an earlier scholar there, also called Rabbi Avram HaChassid. Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam refers to his friend and colleague. Apparently, he was a little older than him, like in some ways a mentor. But this colleague he refers to as Rabbi Avram HaChassid. We now know his full name from the Geniza, but this Rabbi Avram HaChassid had an influence on him in this Beis Medrash of Chasidus. So that apparently was another influence in his life, which may not be directly from the Rambam, although these were Talmidim of the Rambam. And I want to point something out with this Rabbi Avram HaChassid. There's something very interesting, because the Rabeinu Avram quotes a long section from his commentary at the end of Parashas Mishpatim. He used his contemporaries Pirushim, Rabbi Avram HaChassid. He quotes a long piece from Rabbi Avram HaChassid, and upon further examination, as I'm examining it, Rabbi Avram HaChassid is explaining the psukim. He's really just expanding on something that the Rambam himself wrote in Moreh Nevuchim. So it's interesting to me that Rabeinu Avram, the son of the Rambam, would, instead of citing Moreh Nevuchim, he cites Rabbi Avram HaChassid's explanation, which is based on Moreh Nevuchim, probably because it was obvious to all that Rabbi Avram HaChassid, as a student of the Rambam and part of that orbit, well, of course he's explaining according to the Rambam. And Rabbi Avram doesn't see it, he doesn't even need to mention it because it was so obvious. So these are people that are part of the Rambam's orbit, although they had their, this private Beis Medrash. For all we know, maybe the Rambam davened there too. We don't know that. He may have davened there. He may have liked some of their practices, which this is the kind of thing we can't know with such a distance of time. But it's very likely that it did occur, because these are students of the Rambam, and so. But the main influence, of course, is the Rambam. But again, there is this other Beis Medrash that he was shaykh to.
Okay, so I just want to work actually a little backwards here for a second. So you mentioned Rabbi Avram and his writings. Let's talk a little bit about his writings, other than the Chumash commentary, which we'll get to more in a minute.
Okay, so a lot of his writings are based on his father's legacy, and this is another way where we see that Rabeinu Avram views himself as a continuing and defending and totally living the experience of his father's legacy. So there's the first set of works that we should mention are his tshuvos, his responsa. There's 3 collections of his response. The first 2 center around the Rambam's writings. Number 1 is what is the collection that has the name, not given to him by Rabbi Avram himself, but the name that was published under Ma'aseh Nisim. Ma'aseh Nisim is his answers to the criticisms of Reb Daniel Habavli. Reb Daniel Habavli, another personality that we don't know enough about. There was a relationship with the Rambam. There was some degree of respect, but there's also there's some friction there as well. This Reb Daniel is probably a student of, and we do know that he's a student of the schools in Bavel, the yeshivas in Bavel, who did feel somewhat usurped by the Rambam's Seforim and popularity. So that may have been a motivational factor. But Reb Daniel Habavli was a great Talmid Chacham, and he wrote criticisms first of the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam, and then later of the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. Now the criticisms on the Sefer HaMitzvahs, which is a Sefer the Rambam wrote in Judeo-Arabic, Reb Daniel's criticisms are written in Judeo-Arabic, and Rabbi Avram Ben HaRambam answers them in the aforementioned Sefer Ma'aseh Nisim, again in Judeo-Arabic, in the language that they were in. That's one collection of tshuvos. Then the next collection is what's known as Birkas Avram. Again, not a name that he gave it, the name that was given in Europe by the publishers when it was first published, Birkas Avram, and that's the answers to Reb Daniel's questions on Mishnah Torah. Now, Mishnah Torah is a sefer written in Hebrew. Reb Daniel's questions are written in Hebrew, and Rabeinu Avram's answers are also written in Hebrew. So these are 2 collections where are dedicated just to defending the Rambam's positions. Talmidei Chachamim know these Seforim. Well, today they're included in, for the most part, in one way or another, they're all included in the Shabtai Frankel Rambam. The actual Seforim were somewhat rare, but they were excerpted. I'll say the Rambam and published in the Shabtai Frankel Rambam. But Talmidei Chacham know these because Rabbi Yerucham Fischel Perla, in his work on Rabbi Sadia Gaon, he makes very great use of these Seforim. He usually finds in favor of Daniel Habavli. That's my personal ire, but he does give them a lot of press, and he learns them up, and he asks, and he answers, and he goes through the sugi according to them. So that's a very important window into understanding, the school of thought that these Rishonim exhibit. So that's the Chuvas, and then the third collection of Chuvas is his own sefer of Chuvas published by Mekitz and Yerdamim. That's Chuvas Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam. Again, there were some Hebrew ones in there which were written to scholars, from southern France and Provence. There's a lot of, mostly they're in Judeo-Arabic, some are into Yemen, some to other places. A lot of them deal with interesting questions on Tanakh, questions on Hashkafa, a lot of Bezdin questions about Yerushas, about Gittin, about the Dinei Mamonis. There's a lot of that in there. There's some other interesting things there about political things going on with the Reish Galus and Bavel. So that's the stuff, a collection of the writings from his desk, which landed in this third collection of response, and that's Chuvas Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam. So that's the first category, is his Chuvas, and we see that a big emphasis there is defending his father's works. The second sefer that we know from him, and this we only have fragments of it, but he did set to writing a work that the Rambam wishes he had written himself. The Rambam writes in his Tshuva to Pinchas Hadayan. Pinchas Hadayan, by the way, is a Talmud Chacham who was the Dayan in Alexandria, but he was not an Egyptian Jew. He was also from Provence, who had found refuge in Mitzrayim, and the Rambam, respecting his Talmudic abilities, was influential in getting him to the post as the Dayan in Alexandria, and they carried on a correspondence in Hebrew, which is the language that Pinchas understood best. And in his Tshuva to Pinchas Hadayan, the Rambam writes there about his regret for not explaining how he arrived at all the halachas he arrived at in Mishnah Torah. And he says he wished he would have time, and he wished he had the ability to write a companion volume which would explain how he got there. So Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam tried to fill his father's shoes in this regard and write such a chibur. Now, how far he got, we don't know for sure. He writes about how he was busy working with it. He writes that in the Ma'amar Al HaAggados. Some fragmentary evidence does exist for such work. Recently, a page or two on brachas came to light that may have been related to this chibur. Page on the Gemara and the Rif on brachas, which may have been, dedicated to explaining the sugya, to explain the Rambam. It's not clear where it came from, but it's likely related to that work. So that's another work that he was engaged in defending the Rambam or explaining the Rambam. A third work, another one of his famous works, is a treatise called Milchamas Hashem, the Battles of the Lord, and this was written in response. This was written in Hebrew, written to people that may have known about the ban on the Rambam's works, and that heard reports of the burning of the Moreh Nevuchim. And Rabeinu Avraham writes this almost at the end of his life. He writes this in response to those reports, where he defends the Rambam's opinions. He defends his positions in Moreh Nevuchim, and he says that anyone that's who takes umbrage at these positions, and is probably because he's a corporealist, he's a magshim, which is what the Rambam's fought so hard against, and therefore everybody should see that it's the wrong approach and the Rambam's is the right approach. So that's another work he wrote in defense of the Rambam's work. The most famous, perhaps, which is his magnum opus, is the Sefer Hamasbik LeOvdei Hashem. Hamasbik LeOvdei Hashem, again, did not survive in its entirety, although he did finish this work. There is evidence that he finished it. He refers in the parts that we have to parts that we don't have, and that enabled scholars to try to construct what the original Sefer must have looked like. We have a full Sefer from this larger Sefer. We have a chelik on what we call the chelik HaMusar, an ethical part of the work, and that's been around for 80, 90 years now. There's another volume which came only around for 30 or so years, although scholars had excerpted from this manuscript as well, well over 100 years ago. So there's another volume that came out published by Bar Ilan, is the Sefer HaMasbik on Hilchas Tefillah. It's from a halachic part. So they come from two different volumes in this magnum opus called Sefer HaMasbik L'Ovdei Hashem. What is Sefer HaMasbik L'Ovdei Hashem? Should we get into that, Nachi?
Why not? You get a little bit.
Okay, let's give the brief synopsis. Hamasbik L'Ovdei Hashem is what I view it as it was meant as a companion to the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is halachic. It might be, it's written in the Rambam's very rich language, and the Rambam does spice it with little vignettes of Musar and his own ideas and advice, but largely it's halachic. And so I think that the Sefer HaMasbik, which was written in Judeo-Arabic, was probably written to fill the, to fill it in, to give a companion, to give an appreciation of the background of the halacha, to fill in areas which are not addressed as well. Given, for example, it probably included a Pirush Al Hatorah Pesach, which is not in there. It includes a lot about the background of tefillah, and it expands on things that the Rambam says. And when it gets too technical, Rabeinu Avraham will even write in this Masbik, he'll say, and refer to what, for the rest of the rules, refer to what my father wrote in the Mishnah Torah. So he was, writing in the vernacular, giving it appreciation. Now, there was also another goal of the Sefer, just the way it was constructed. It was supposed to draw somebody, and this is where the title comes from, Hamasbik L'Ovdei Hashem. It was supposed to guide someone to achieving perfection, achieving ethical and moral perfection, which would guide him towards the final volume, which includes the ethical sefer that we mentioned. It also included in sections that are now lost. It includes ways to try to attain Ruach HaKodesh, attain communion with Hashem, a certain level of spiritual ecstasy, and that's related to the pietistic goals of this Beis Medrash that he ran. And maybe that wasn't for everybody, but somebody that got to that madrega, they needed a guide, and this sefer, at least the end of it, did provide that guide. Portions of this sefer, like I said, were known to scholars for a while. The Musar part was first published by Samuel Rosenblatt, whose father was the famous Yossel Rosenblatt. Samuel traveled to Israel specifically to learn Arabic. I found a cute mention of him in Eisenstein's Masois, Eisenstein's Journeys. David Eisenstein writes, I found on the boat traveling to Israel with me the son of Chazan Yossel Rosenblatt. He was going to Israel to learn Arabic, he said. So he translated from the Arabic into English. He called it the Highways to Perfection. The common edition today is the Feldheim edition, which is a Hebrew translation of the English translation of the Arabic translation. Although it was fixed up by Rabbi Winselberg from Miami, he did fix up the translation where possible, and his English translation is eminently more readable and more accurate than the original Rosenblatt edition, and I highly recommend it. I used it myself a lot, and that's what's available as far as the Musar Sefer. And like we said, the Bar Ilan edition, it came out in 89. It was again reissued recently, supposedly a corrected edition, but nobody knows exactly what was corrected, when it was corrected, and how it was corrected.
Okay, right. Those are available. Also, you mentioned Samuel Rosenblatt. I think he was a professor. He also translated, so by his English edition of Emunas V'Deis, or Psajugai.
Yes.
That he did as well.
Yeah, he made good use of his Arabic.
Yeah, so now the Ma'amar Hashem, also you mentioned of Rambam, so there's the Musar of Cook edition, and also in English, Dr. Fred Rosner translated, so you can get an English edition of that as well.
That English edition is it also has a very, very good biographical introduction, which discusses a lot of what we discuss and more. So that's, if you want to understand the Maimonidean controversies, it gives you a good synopsis into that as well. So yeah, I recommend that book too.
Yeah, I'll try to put links to this stuff in the show's notes. Okay, now we come to his Pirush and Chumash, which we left out. The Ma'amar Al HaAggados, I want to say, I don't know if we said that. So that we dedicated the previous episode to. So I don't know how much we'll get into it. It isn't that old episode. I'll put the link to that episode in the show's notes here. I don't want to go, because that's a separate thing we discussed. That's a short thing. I think with your note, you can talk about it just one side, but it's like a 200-page sefer. There's 100 pages of the Ma'amar Al HaAggados, and with your notes, and then there's 100 pages of your own kuntras in there. So that's a very, very small thing. If you want to just say a word about it.
You just to fill out the picture here, the Ma'amar Al HaAggados, as I mentioned on that episode, was originally part of this Sefer HaMasbik as well. So that's like another section of this, it contained the chapter on the approach to Haggadah, something that you're not going to find in a Mishnah Torah, but something that, of course, informs the student of Mishnah Torah about the approach to Haggadah, and that was in this Sefer as well. And one other feature of that of the Ma'amar Al HaAggados, which is relevant to what we've discussed now, is that the Rabeinu Avraham writes there that his father wanted to write such a mimer to explain how to approach Haggadah and didn't have a chance, which is why he's doing it. So again, you see Rabeinu Avraham trying to fill in the gaps of his father's literary legacy, and again, viewing himself as completely the heir to his father's spiritual, intellectual, and literary heritage.
Okay, so let's go to the Pirush Al Chumash. So first of all, just get it out of the way. There is only Bereshit and Shemais. The rest doesn't exist. I know I'm asked this. I'm sure you're asked this many, many more times than I am. I have no personal connection to this, but it's only Bereshit and Shemais. You'll talk about this. He never wrote the rest of it, so don't expect any more to come out. But let's talk about the commentary on Chumash.
Okay, so did he even write more? I'm of the opinion that he did not, because we have Rabeinu Avraham talking about this Pirush himself in a letter that he wrote in the original Hebrew, and he writes there that the letter was written about 5 years before he died, and he writes then that he started working on this Pirush. He says, "I finished the Sefer HaMaspik. I've disseminated that. I'm started working on the Pirush now." Apparently, he was asked for somebody had heard he was working on it and wanted a copy of the Sefer, and also apparently a Hebrew-speaking rabbi, because he wrote the letter in Hebrew. He says, "So I started working on the Pirush, but I'm only about halfway through Bereshis now. And it would take me only a year or so to finish it," he says, "but I hardly have any time to work on it because of my communal responsibilities and my responsibilities to as a court physician. I don't have time to work on it. And even if I had time to work on it and finish it, I still wouldn't be able to give it to you right away because it would have to be, I'd have to go over it. I'd have to have it checked and edited, and then I'd have to have it translated for you. So therefore, he turns down the request, but at the same time, he does tell us a lot about the Pirush. So I think that at the rate he was going, he managed to finish Sefer Shemais, but I don't think he got much further. And another indication of that is because the manuscript we have, and I'll talk a little bit more about the manuscript, but the manuscript we have is copied from an earlier manuscript, which I believe was probably Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam's original manuscript. The one that we have ends after Shemais, and there's a lengthy colophon, which is where the scribe would write, kind of put his signature, put his stamp, his personality. He'd write a little why he wrote it, when he wrote it, and include a blessing for the donor or the patron who had sponsored the project. So this is that was the end of his job. The end of his job finished at Shemais. I believe it's likely that's all there was. If there were any other fragments, it didn't amount to much, and those are, if there were any, they're lost forever. So Bereshit and Shemais is all we have. People were confused about whether there were more coming, because I put out first the Bereshit, then put out a Shemais. So to solve that problem, I did print. I had a slipcase made. Now it looks like a set. So hopefully that indicates to people this is all there is. Now, unfortunately, even in the manuscript that we do have on Bereshit and Shemais, we're missing the beginning of the Sefer, which most likely had the introduction, as well as the first 20 chapters. The Sefer starts essentially in the middle of chapter 20, although there was one section from the missing, the one part of the earlier section did survive, and that's the end of chapter 1, Perek Aleph, the beginning of Perek Beis, and Parshas Bereshis. But after that, there's nothing on the rest of Bereshis, Noach, or Lechacha, and it only picks up the beginning of Vayera and Perek Chaf. So it's and the parts that we have on Bereshis are considerable. Just the end of Perek Aleph and the beginning of Perek Beis. It's likely it was a good chelik of the Sefer that has gone missing. Efforts are now underway to try to reconstruct what we can from other documentary and fragmentary evidence to what might have been contained in there. I found some other manuscripts. I found quotations to pieces of Sefer HaMaspik which are relevant. So I've been trying, in the Sefer itself, at the end of Bereshit, I found a piece of Maspik that had never been published, and I translated it into Hebrew and put it at the end of Parshas Bereshis. I've since been working on more, again, small, but I found more for Bereshis and for Parshas Noach. I'm working on something for Lech Lecha, so maybe in future editions I'll be able to fill in the gap ever so slightly. But again, it's a tragic loss which will never be recouped without the original Sefer.
Okay, so when did he write this Pirush? And you said you have this letter from him towards the end of his life, and do we know why he decided to write a commentary on Chumash?
So we don't have his introduction. Now the Rambam wrote introductions to all Seforim. In Ashkenaz, that wasn't the minhag to write introductions, but in Spain and in Bavel and all those who followed in their footsteps, like the Rambam. That was the approach. They would write introductions. So it's likely that this Pirush did have an introduction, and in which Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam himself would have given the answers to these questions. We can only surmise, and it's a good guess, I think, but not complete. What does the Pirush, judging by the nature of the Pirush, first of all, it may be also to fill in the gap. Maybe that's one of the works that the Rambam never wrote. The Rambam did not write any Seforim on Mikra. There is a spurious work on Megillas Esther, which is a tribute to the Rambam, but that's not the Rambam. It was fashionable to sell works as Rambam's works, so perhaps that's what happened there. There's even that even happened with the Pirush Al Hatorah and other works like that. So, but the Rambam did not write any works on Mikra. Maybe Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam felt that this is another way of filling in and supplementing and buttressing his father's legacy, and that's why he wrote the Pirush on Chumash. But judging by the nature of the Pirush, it seems that he felt this would be useful. There was again, he draws on Ibn Ezra, he draws on his grandfather's own Pirush. His father-in-law, we know, wrote a Pirush. There were other Pirushs abounding, but his Pirush wants to explain the simple meaning of the Psukim. Wants to analyze what has been said in brief and give you the short meaning of the Psukim, but it's also focused with giving you the message of the Psukim. Not so much just the literal translation, but also why did this happen? And what was the reason for the Torah telling us this? Very often, Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam goes out of his way to stress that there's a message for the serious student of the Torah in what's told in the Torah, and that it follows the precedent of the Rambam writes in Ma'amar Al HaAggados, that the entire Torah is written to improve your deis, to improve your emunah, and to improve your midas. Rav Sadia writes similarly in places. So Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam may have been trying to show you exactly how. And in my introduction to Shemais, I wrote further that I think this also ties in with his vision for providing guidance for the chassid. The chassid is supposed to look to the Torah for guidance. And he writes that in numerous places. He himself follows that advice in Sefer HaMaspik, in the ethical part where all the midas that he discusses, he shows. And let me show you where the Torah stresses this midah. Episodes in Tanakh that show you the value of anava and the value of bitachon and the value of his baitedus, which is solitude, one of the pietistic practices. So he finds you precedents in the Torah for all these things. And he even writes explicitly that the chassid is someone that should look for the meaning of the Torah and live according to the meaning of the Torah. The message that the Torah gives over, not explicitly, he should seek to understand it and follow it. That might have been another motivation for writing this Pirush, was to bring that message out. And that's why we'll find him sometimes highlighting this message. Like, for example, where the Torah writes that Avraham Avinu made a big suda b'yom higamal es Yitzchak. When Yitzchak was weaned, Avraham Avinu made a big suda for all the locals, all the non-Jewish locals that he was working so hard to influence. Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam says, why does the Torah tell us this? Because the Torah wants to show you that you should be generous, you should be expansive, and that you should be more Irvim Abrius. You should have the adivus and the generosity of spirit that Avraham Avinu had. So, and he talked about Yaakov Avinu recounting to Lavan about how, despite all the trickery and all the sly deals that he had been dealt, he still acted loyally and faithfully and devotedly to Lavan's business. And Rabbi Avraham writes, that's the Torah is telling you this because it wants you to act this way with your boss. Everybody has problems with their boss. Still, be loyal and devoted, just like Yaakov Avinu was. In fact, he'll sometimes even cite negative examples. And I know this is a contentious point in recent generations. I once heard a shir from the late Rabbi Dr. Sprecher, where he highlighted the difference between Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's approach and the Reb Chaim Brisker's approach. And he said, Reb Chaim Brisker says we can learn from the others, but only positive things. You can chas v'shalom to learn, from their, to avoid attribute a negative example and learn. Chas v'shalom says such a thing. But he says Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch does do that. Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch famously says that Yitzchak's treatment of Yaakov and Esav is to teach us, not to follow that approach. So, in a similar vein, we have, you can find a hint of that in Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam, where he writes that the story of the episode of Dinah is told over in Parshas Vayishlach to teach us that we have to be more vigilant and protective over our women. Can't let them, roam the countryside. Again, this is a value that was obviously had a different meaning for people in Muslim Egypt, where Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam was writing. but he sees that that's the lesson of the Torah in this case. Don't let Dinah out like Yaakov did.
Yeah, you have a similar Pirush of the Rambam Avinu. Parshas Lech Lecha, we're quoting this Parshas Lech Lecha, he talks about Rambam Avinu going down to Mitzrayim.
That's right.
The Ramban said Rambam Avinu Chat B'Shal G'Gedayla, there's a whole Pirush on this. So similar type of thing. So, I mean, what more do you have to say? Also, I mean, we can go from here. We'll come back to we'll discuss the manuscript and the translation, all that stuff. I guess a little later. Once we're ready here, what do you have to say about the style? I mean, you've already talked a lot about the stylistic thing that he goes through, but are there anything else you would add about the style of the commentary?
So it's important to understand what the Pirush is doing. You have to understand the Pshat Mahalach of the Rishonim. It's very, very hard to appreciate Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam if you do not know, what motivated Parshanim like Ibn Ezra and Rashbam and Reb Sadia going. We don't, we're not taught this in yeshiva. We were brought up on Chumash Rashi, and then later we were exposed to Ramban, who's although he certainly has an appreciation for Pshat, and we'll point that out often enough, but still it's. The Ramban's Pirush, as he himself says in his Akdama, venerates the Rashi's approach, and the Rashi's approach is not consistent with the Pshat approach, and Rashi himself admitted that to his grandson, the Rashbam, famously. So it's hard for a typical, if all you know is what you were taught in yeshiva, it's hard to have an appreciation of Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam's approach to Chumash. So I think it's worth spending a minute here just explaining what is the Pshat approach. What is it? Now, Rashi does say occasionally that he will emphasize that out of all the midrashim, he's picking the midrash which fits best with Pshat. Or I didn't get into this far afield midrashim because I'm ani liyasher pshuto shamikra basi. So we know the term Pshat, but that's not what I mean when I say the Pshat approach. Because Rashi's approach is primarily explaining the Chumash the way it was explained by Chazal. And the Pshat approach seeks to say, let's understand the Chumash the way you would understand it without knowing Chazal. Let's just see what Chumash itself says. Now, there's two very divergent expressions of this Pshat school. There's the Rashbam's school, the sages of northern France, and later southern France, who explored Pshat, and then there's the Ibn Ezra coming from the Geonik and the Andalusian. Andalusian is a term for Muslim Spain. The Ramban's Spain was no longer Andalusia. It was governed by Christian. It was Christian Spain, and they had a very different culture than Muslim Spain. So the Andalusian approach, which is an offshoot of the earlier Geonic approach, celebrated mostly by Reb Sadia and Reb Hai and Shulman Chafri in different levels and variations, but that's a different Pshat school. And without belaboring the point now, it's a long shmooze for another time. But the Rashbam's Pshat approach asserts that the supremacy belongs to Rashi's approach and Chazal's approach. The true meaning of the Psukim is what Chazal say is the meaning of the Psukim, and the other, Pshat is also worth something, and that's worth exploring because it's another level. And if Hashem wrote it in a certain way, it must be that there's some value in understanding it. What value is somewhat dubious because if it's not Chazal's approach, and it's not the quote unquote true approach. So what is the value? Rashbam never makes it perfectly clear what is that value, but it's definitely secondary to the Chazal, to the Rashi approach. The Ibn Ezra, on the other hand, he says no. The Pshat is the true approach. And what Chazal tell you is said for a purpose. Sometimes it's an asmachta, sometimes it's musar, sometimes it's a remez, but the true approach is Pshat. Now, a very, very interesting outgrowth from this dichotomy is that the Rashbam will sometimes be even much more extreme in his Pshat than Ibn Ezra. And the reason is because Pshat is anyway not the true meaning, it's just another additional meaning, so it could be anything. It doesn't have to stem with halacha, it could be totally against halacha because it doesn't matter. It's not binding, it's not authoritative, it's not the quote-unquote true Pshat anyway. So he's now permitted to go very far afield. He even goes so far as to say that Chazal themselves may not have been aware of Pshat, because after all, why should they? They know the true meaning. And Pshatim are something which he calls mischachim b'chol yom. They're discovered every day, they're new, they change. They're not authoritative, so anything can be Pshat, anything can pass as Pshat as long as it sounds like Pshat. That's the response. So he's much, it's free and loose pshat because it does not have to be authoritative. The Ibn Ezra, on the other hand, who's fierce about pshat and how pshat is so important, so true, he's also now constrained to make sure that his pshat jives with halacha. His pshat, because if it's true, and halacha is true, so the pshat has to jive, which is why the Ibn Ezra, some people will find it curious that the Ibn Ezra will sometimes quote Karaim right, left, and center without any hesitation, and then sometimes they'll go on a tangent and curse them out, most vile, play of words on their names, and this guy's a nachash, and this guy's a serpent, and this guy's a shar, and all kinds of things he'll say about different karam. Why is that? And that is because he feels that if they take their pshat against halacha, then they've got to be, you got to eradicate such a pshat. So a pshat that goes against halacha can't be true pshat. So it's an interesting dichotomy, which is an outgrowth of their different approaches. So the Ibn Ezra follows the Geonic pshat approach, and sometimes the Ibn Ezra himself goes a little too far for the Ramban's liking against the pshat of against the explanations of Chazal, but never against halacha. I mean, certainly not overtly. And if it does seem like it's against halacha, there must be a good rationale for it, because the Ibn Ezra is not, he himself avowedly is sticking with the halacha, like he says, and the Ramban will sometimes call him out for it, because the Ramban knows that that the Ibn Ezra should agree with him in these cases. So that's the pshat approach of the Geonic school. It's understanding the psukim at their plain meaning, and if Chazal say otherwise, it's an asmachta or some other unauthoritative explanation said for a purpose, but not to be presented as the true meaning of the psukim. And this Ibn Ezra didn't invent this. We sometimes look at the Ibn Ezra as a little bit of an outlier because we're not used to this, but the Ibn Ezra is really representative of a very full school, full of the all the Geonim that preceded him in Spain, and going back to Reb Sadia Geon. That's the approach they took, and this is also the approach of the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim often enough. And that's the approach of Rabeinu Avraham Ben HaRambam. So you can't appreciate Rabbi Avraham without understanding Pshat, and that's why I dedicated a big portion of the Akdama in Bereshis to understanding what is the Pshat Mahalach.
So do you have an example you could share with the listeners to kind of show them what you mean by this?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you an example. Coming up, we're going to read the Pirush Al Hatorah. There, Chazal, quoted by Rashi, they date exactly when the Akedah happened, according to which date it turns out that Yitzchak is 37 years old at the time of the Akedah, and that's when Rivka was born. It's fully mapped out in the rabbinic chronology. Now Ibn Ezra already hints that he doesn't accept this as pshat in the psukim. He's according to him, it seems that the simple reading is that Yitzchak was a little boy, a nar, a young lad at the time of the Akedah. So I don't know if the Rambam did or did not know Ibn Ezra. Not the man, but the Pirush. That's an open question. There's a very fine article about it by Isidore Tursky, which was included in the recent Hebrew, the Hebrew volume K'mayin Hamas Gaber. It's there about exactly to determine, is there any concrete evidence that the Rambam did use Pirush Ibn Ezra? We don't know that for sure. The letter addressed to Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam, his ethical will, where he says learn only Ibn Ezra, is accepted now in the scholarly world as a forgery. So that's outside of that. Is there any evidence? Not clear. But in this case, the Rambam, quoted in the Pirush by Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam, echoes the same exact sentiments of Ibn Ezra. And Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam writes that even though if you look in the Midrashim, it'll tell you that Yitzchak was 37, if that was the case, then Yitzchak's role in the Akedah should be much more prominent. For a 37-year-old man to submit himself to be sacrificed for Hashem, even though he didn't even get the nevuah, it was a nevuah that was given to his father, to Avraham Avinu. That should be a very, very important thing. The pasuk makes no mention of that. Therefore, he says, I prefer to say, and he says his father. He quoting his father on this, the Rambam, that that's not pshat. And in according to pshat, he was a young boy at the time. Now, what do you make of Chazal that say otherwise? So people who see Ibn Ezra, they'll kind of write this off. It's, I don't know, and they'll say maybe a karoi put it in there. It wasn't really the Ibn Ezra because they don't understand the pshat approach. The pshat approach says that when Chazal said this sort of thing, they weren't saying it on authoritative tradition. They were exploring an approach that looks at the psukim for allegorical reasons, for ethical reasons, and it's a valid way of explaining the pasuk, but it's not the authoritative translation of the pasuk. That's the way they understood Chazal, and that's part of it. Harkens back to what we wrote about in the Ma'amar Al HaAggados, which is where where Rabeinu Avraham details that Rambam's and the Geonim's approach to Aggadah was exactly like that. That the Aggadah has very important value, but its value is not that it's the authoritative interpretation of what they were talking about. That's not the value, and that's evident throughout the Pirush. And this is a primary example of that, where the Rambam, quoted by Rav Avraham Ben HaRambam, says that he follows the Ibn Ezra's approach and says that not like the Midrashim, but Yitzchak was actually a much younger boy. Another example, you see this kind of approach where, according to Chazal, and this is something where the Ramban has a very vocal dispute with Ibn Ezra about whether Yocheved was Nelda ben HaChaimes. Yocheved is the 70th soul, that 70th person that came down with Yaakov to Mitzrayim, because she was born ben HaChaimes, which makes Yocheved a very, very old woman at the time she gives birth to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Ramban quotes Ibn Ezra and takes great vocal issue with Ibn Ezra's approach. He claims it's not like Chazal, and it's terrible to question Chazal. Chazal said this needs to happen, so of course it happened. But again, so Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam says he said he didn't see the Pirush in the Ramban, but he hedges his bet. He says if Chazal had a drush, if they had a Kabbalah, if they have this on authority that's what happened, then I fully accept it. But if they didn't have it on authority and he's not sure, he says then I would explain the Pesukim like Ibn Ezra. So again, he's not, just because Chazal said it by him doesn't mean that that's authoritative, and not because he's casting down it, because he believes Chazal themselves never intended to present it as authoritative. Some things they did have on tradition, some things not. That's why he has this comment over there.
You mentioned he quotes his father, the Rambam. I mean, this is something that's nice about the Pirush. Not the right way to say it is that there's a lot of quotations from the Rambam that we don't have from otherwise. Like you said, he did not write a commentary on Chumash. There's these various likutim on Chumash, but he didn't actually write something. So, what other interesting things does he quote from his father in the commentary? Very interesting things.
First of all, on the very big, commentarial controversies, he will cite his father's opinion. He had gone through Chumash with his father. Like, for example, did Yisrael come before Matan Torah? Did Yisrael come after Matan Torah? Where there's machlekes in Midrashim, there's machlekes in Chazal, there's machlekes in Mefarshim. And so Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam cites the various opinions. He says, to me, it seems from the Psukim that he came before. And that's, and he quotes his father, and his father was also machriya like that. In another, the question which bothered all the great Mefarshim and the theologians of that time, what exactly is the Shechina? What exactly did Moshe Rabbeinu see? What did the people at Har Sinai? They shouldn't come see. What does see mean? Does see mean an intellectual perception? Did Moshe Rabbeinu only have an intellectual perception of God? Did he actually see something visual? So, he quotes his father's opinion on it. His father says that both are valid approaches, but his father, the Rambam says you should best to understand this as an intellectual perception. And Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam says, I will offer an approach which jives with what my father said, while at the same time making a compromise with the other Mefarshim. He says it was both. He says it was a little bit. There was a physical manifestation of the intellectual achievement that they were able to, the intellectual experience. It had a physical manifestation and a metaphysical manifestation. Both were true at the same time. He says this is a perfect pshara, perfect compromise to bring my father in line with the other Mefarshim, and my father would have no problem with this. He says, in various places like that, he'll bring his father's hachra on issues that he treats in the commentary.
Okay, so going to go a little bit more out of order here. I want to discuss a little bit your notes and your edition. Obviously, there is the whole story of the manuscript. There's the translation and the more, but your edition. First of all, your notes sometimes take up half a page or even more. I mean, when I tell the listeners who are not familiar with Sefer, there are hundreds of notes, and many of them are very, very long. And I mean that in the best possible way. I think it's really nice. So what did you set out to do? Now, I don't know what you talked about your initial idea for the project, but I mean, set out to do and you're actually going to publish it. What was your idea? What did the notes end up being, your notes on the commentary?
I felt, and people may take issue with this. I've heard people that have taken issue with this, that the notes are too much, and maybe they're right. For them, the notes are too much. But I felt that today's day and age, if you want it in any other format, you can get it. You can get a digital format if you want it. I'm going to give you the full experience that I had. I'm not going to skimp when I quote other citations from the Ramban or others. Who's going to go look it up? If I say, compare this to the Ramban's approach, which differs in a little bit of a nuance based on, on a previous, dichotomy in their Pirushim, who's going to go look it up and figure it out? So I'll flesh it out and I bring it, anything that I felt was relevant that will help give you a better flavor of what Rabeinu Avraham is saying, where he's coming from, other things he said elsewhere. I'll bring the full quotation when I say that the Ma'amar Al HaAggados is the background for such an idea. For example, where he talks about Yitzchak digging the wells, where he says that the reason he called the wells asek, business, and fighting and quarreling, why did he give them these names? Because Rabbi Avraham writes, because for Yitzchak, having to deal with earning a living and the vicissitudes of just getting by and digging and dealing with other people, for him that was a terrible burden. Because for Yitzchak, just avodas Hashem was all he wanted, and earning a living was a distraction, and that's why he gives. This is what Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam writes. So I highlight that this is a very central concept in Ma'amar Al HaAggados, where the Rambam talks about the Avos and writes about how even when they did business, their main focus was on Hashem all the time, and that's why they had the tremendous hashgacha pratis that they had. So I'll quote the whole citation there. If it's too much for some people, I can't help it. But I think it's beneficial to those who want the full experience. They want to appreciate exactly the nuance and where he's coming from, get a feeling of what went into it. Whenever I changed the translation, I felt that incumbent, to bring the original Arabic. People can look, I didn't bring the full Arabic text, but where I diverged from the existing translation, I brought the Arabic text, what the original translation was, and then often I would explain why I translated differently. I'll give you examples even where such a term, such a concept has a different nuance in writings of the Rambam and Rabeinu Avraham. So I put it all out there. Maybe at some time I would work on an English edition, a user-friendly edition, at which time maybe make it streamlined. But now that the work is out there and available for anyone who wants it, I felt it was valuable to provide it.
Yeah, if anyone wants to subsidize an English edition, email Moshe. Anyways, let's go. So the manuscript. Let's talk about the manuscript and its story. There is a story there. You mentioned kind of where the manuscript is from, but I want to talk about the manuscript.
It's an amazing story in my mind, and it shows the fantastic hashgacha pratis for all the Seforim we have today. Each sefer has a story because they've had to survive. Every sefer that comes down to us, now we have Seforim stores. Now we have digital repositories of Seforim. Now we have many people have very extensive and expansive private libraries. Seforim are never more available than they are now, but till they got from when they were written in the times we showed them earlier, till they were able to be printed and disseminated, especially in modern times, it was quite a journey. And it's each sefer has its own act of providence, and I want to just highlight that with the story of Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam's Pirush. This sefer was, like you said, was written by Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam. It never was disseminated in his lifetime, and probably it's because of the exacting standards that he held himself to, which also, by the way, has echoes of the Rambam's own approach. The Rambam writes that in his letter to the Chachmei Lunil in France. He writes about how a person should never disseminate anything before he's had a chance to go through it, edit it, look through it as many times as possible. So Rabbi Avraham, in all likelihood, never disseminated his own Pirush because he died before he had a chance to edit it and go through it. And then actually there's even some evidence, it's written pretty, it's pretty extensive, although here and there's a pasuk with no Pirush. There's a pasuk and no Pirush. And I believe that it's not something missing from the manuscript, like has been suggested in the earlier edition, but I think it's because Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam himself never got around to it. He wanted to write something here, didn't have the sefer in front of him, wanted to look into it further, didn't write it, and he continued with the next pasuk, leaving a blank spot that he can get back to later. So the sefer was never fully completed on his end, and that's why it was never disseminated. There's almost no mention of it. I say almost because there is mention through Reb David HaNugget. Reb David HaNugget is the one who owned the library of his ancestors. Reb David HaNugget, Reb Avram's own son was Reb David HaNugget. That Reb David HaNugget was responsible for leaving us with the Medrash Reb David HaNugget, which bears almost no resemblance at all to the Pirush of Reb Avram. Reb Avram's own son wrote a Pirush, an allegorical compilation of Midrashim, which had a practical use that the Nugget would use these Midrashim in his weekly sermons Shabbos afternoon. And he would tell the people, give the people Midrashim. That's what the people wanted. Scholars wanted the Pshat, people wanted the Midrashim, and that's what they got. So that's Reb David's son. Reb David's own son was also Reb Avram. Reb Avram's son was Rabbi Yehoshua HaNugget, who left us Chuvas Rabbi Yehoshua HaNugget, a sefer also devoted to answering the problems that the Chachmei Teman had raised in the Rambam. And the last of the Negidim is Rabbi Yehoshua, son of Reb David, Rabbi Yehoshua HaNugget. This Reb David HaNugget is a scholar in his own right. He was the last Nugget to hold the post. For some reason, which we still don't know, we don't know enough about it, he left in the late 1300s, he left Mitzrayim, he left Egypt and moved to Syria, taking with him his library, which was a very extensive library of manuscripts, including the extremely valuable originals of many of the Rambam's own works and Rambam's own works. Today, from among all the Rishonim's works, I think the Rambam is unique. That's the only Rishon where we have an original autograph written by a Rishon. We have copies of a lot of Rishonim's works written in medieval times, but the autograph of the Rishon it's very, very rare. Maybe not impossible, but very rare. We once spoke about a tshuva of the Marik in the original. It's you may have some, but a sefer of the magnitude of the Rambam that was copied and as popular as the Rambam to still have the original it's unreal. And we have many volumes of the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos that came from this library of Reb David HaNugget. The most authoritative text of Mishnah Torah comes from his library, the Sefer HaChosim, known as Huntington 80. I think it's a very authoritative work. It has the Rambam's own signature where he says, "This is not my copy, but it was copied from my copy." And that's the earliest one we have. The Rambam's Mishnah Torah we don't have, but the copy with his signature we do have. The Rambam's, like I said, the Pirush HaMishnayos we do have. We have 5 of the 6 volumes that he wrote of Pirush HaMishnayos. So this was all in the library of Reb David HaNugget. And Reb David HaNugget learned these Seforim. He wrote Haggos on the side of them. He had a lot of other Seforim as well, in philosophy and Medrash and Halacha, Parshanis and poetry. He had loads of Seforim on refuah and on medicine, a lot of stuff. So this library came with him to Syria, Aleppo, where he landed up, and it's probably stayed in the family's possession for some more generations. In the 1600s, the Christian, the Christian government from England had a mission set up in Syria for the businessmen who were, occupied on business ventures there, and they had different scholars at the time. The church was very, very interested in Hebraic studies, and they published a lot of scholars. They produced a lot of scholars of note, and these missionaries who ministered out there in Syria and the Levant were on the hunt for manuscripts. They had an obsession with getting old manuscripts, and they had money, a lot of money, so they managed to acquire a lot of these valuable manuscripts. In particular, the one that interests us now is Robert Huntington. Robert Huntington paid good money from maybe not the descendants, maybe at the time it was in other hands, but he bought a copy of Reb Avraham Ben HaRambam's Pirush. Now, this copy was commissioned by Reb David HaNugget, who, like we said, had the originals, most likely the original he had in his hand. And this copy was made for him in Syria by a scribe who signed his name, like in the aforementioned colophon at the end of the manuscript, that he copied it for Reb David the Great Nugget. Reb David HaNugget used this manuscript that was made for him. It's a beautiful manuscript, very readable still today. All these years, 500 years later, 600 years later, still very readable, beautiful manuscript, besides the part that's missing. Unfortunately, maybe the binder didn't do as well a job as the scribe, but the part that we have is very eminently beautiful, easy to read. And Reb David HaNugget used this manuscript and compared it with apparently the original or an earlier copy, because he made corrections on the basis of an earlier copy. All along the margins are Reb David's corrections. A line was missing, he supplied it. Sometimes there was a line that was originally only a marginal gloss, not from the original sefer, which the copyist had now put into the sefer. So Reb David HaNugget made a notation that this line actually doesn't belong in there, it belongs in the Gillion. He wrote these notes in Arabic, but he went through the entire Sefer and corrected it. This copy with David's margins were his marginal notes is what was sold to Robert Huntington. Robert Huntington brought his considerable collection of manuscripts back to England with him, and when he died, they landed up in Oxford's library. And that's how we have the Pirush Al Hatorah around until this very day, through the providential act of this Christian missionary buying it for probably a very hefty sum from the Yarshim, who would otherwise have kept it, and it would have gotten lost like all their other Seforim. So now we have it. It was this Huntington manuscript in Oxford Library is still visible today, and I've consulted it myself as I was working on the Pirush. I went through every single page and compared it, and with great profit. Not a few times I was able to correct a reading or see a nuance or understand where a gloss belongs because I was able to see the original manuscript.
Okay, so now the original published edition, when was it originally published? How did that come about? And also the manuscript was written in Arabic, so that had to be translated. So what's the story with that?
The very wealthy Talmud Chacham, Suleiman David Sassoon in England, who had his own nice library, he was connected with Oxford. He had discovered this manuscript in Oxford, sitting there, and he studied it and drew close to it, and he felt right away that this is an excellent Pirush, and it would be a shame to leave it languishing in the library without bringing it to the attention of the Torah world. So he commissioned first a scholar by the name of Yosef Duri. Yosef Duri was an Arabic, a native Arabic speaker. He commissioned him to translate this sefer for him. Yosef Duri got through all of Bereshis and then he did not continue. At that time, Rabbi Sassoon found a young scholar, an amazing scholar named Ephraim Yehuda Wiesenberg, Ernst, in the original Ernst Wiesenberg. Wiesenberg was in Oxford at the time studying or learning and getting a degree, and he had learned Arabic as well. So Sassoon now commissioned him to go over the translation on Bereshis prepared by Duri, and also to translate the second volume of on Shemais. So this, I think he worked on it for about 5 years, he said, and this edition came out in 1958. The Arabic on one side, the translation on the other, with notes and an extensive introduction, all by this Rabbi Dr. Wiesenberg. That was the original publication in 1958. There is another, probably a pre-publication edition, which is the edition that you can find in Hebrew books. I have a hard copy of it at home, and that is also published in 1958, where it said it was published for the bar mitzvah of the son of this Rabbi Sassoon. Apparently, Rabbi Sassoon, it was almost ready, but not quite ready. The last few pages, there are some changes with the later, fuller edition. But the main distinction is that this edition does not have Wiesenberg's introduction. It does not have the appendix with corrections and other things in the appendix. It doesn't have that. So this edition was apparently somewhat of a pre-publication edition, just in time for the bar mitzvah. But it was later finished and finalized by Wiesenberg, and then the edition in the same year is the more readily available, or the more commonly known, the fuller edition with his introduction.
And then we had later on editions that were just the Hebrew without any notes, without anything.
The edition that I used, that I was introduced to, did not have the notes, it did not have the Arabic. They took out, of course, they took out the introduction as well. This edition was apparently sanctioned by the ears of Rabbi Sassoon, but since my read on this, and maybe somebody knows more information, I've heard other stories which may or may not be true, but my read is that since the permission came from the Sassoons felt they had a right to the text, but they couldn't give permission on the whole sefer, which was they had sponsored the work, but it was really Wiesenberg's intellectual property, so they just felt they can give the text over. I'm guessing there may have been some other motivation here as well, maybe less than savory, I don't know, but so the text that was available did not have the Arabic, did not have any notes. Now the notes included the Mar Makaimis, it included where the Psukim are, included the references. All that was gone. So now you just have one block of Hebrew text, which was very hard to read. But that was the only edition that was available when I came on the scene, and even that was hard to find and out of print. But that was all that was available.
So now your edition, again, leaving aside the notes, because that we discussed already, what did you go and do to the text? And anyone who will see Your edition, I'll just say you have the psukim, anytime he's commenting on a pasuk in bold font, and then you have a bunch of different things going on, different fonts, brackets, and you do explain this in the introduction of each volume, but what did you do?
I was trying to, and I was not, and I admit I was not fully successful. I was trying to make the text just at least appear more user-friendly. It's still somewhat complicated, but I think it can be navigated. The original Wiesenberg text, when Wiesenberg had two approaches here. When he felt that a word will help the translation, even though it wasn't actually a literal translation, he would add that in parentheses. When he felt, and he took a lot of liberty in this regard, and I'll get to that in a minute why, but when he felt that the original Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, was missing something for whatever reason, so he would supply it in the Arabic in brackets, and then corresponding translation also in brackets. So someone looking at the Hebrew text would see words added in parentheses and words added in brackets. With the original edition would be explanatory notes. He would understand that the bracketed insertions are insertions where Wiesenberg amended the Arabic text, and the additions in insertions in parentheses are where it was just to help with the flow, to make it read better, but it was not representing anything found in the original Arabic. Now, the edition that I used, which did not have any notes and did not have the Arabic, this was terribly confusing. Modern convention is that parentheses are taking something out, brackets are adding something in, but it didn't make any sense in this regard. Why are some things parentheses, why are some things brackets? It was totally and utterly confusing. And until I went and tracked down the original, which was with some considerable effort, I had no idea what was going on. So I decided that I'm going to adopt a much more user-friendly approach. I'm not going to have there's going to be no parentheses in the text. Parentheses are only going to be used in a smaller font to indicate a ma'amar or some other, or a word of explanation, a translation. But instead, I'm going to have bracketed insertions where there is grounds to amend the Arabic text. Now, some of these insertions in Judeo-Arabic were made by Reb David HaNagid. Like Reb David HaNagid annotated the text and showed where some lines were missing, words were missing. He added those in himself. So those bracketed insertions, I said, I'm going to leave them the same size and font as the regular text to indicate that these belong in the text, they're part of the regular text. Whereas Wiesenberg's emendations based on what he felt was missing, without any actual textual evidence, I put those in a smaller font to differentiate it. So I don't know if this was the best approach. It may still be confusing to some people with different fonts and sizes, but at least I think there's a system here, there's a method here. Now I mentioned this earlier, and I have to point this out. It appears that Rabbi Dr. Wiesenberg was not aware, and through no fault of his own, this only came to light recently with the added focus and attention given to Reb David HaNagid. I don't think he was aware that all these corrections on the side were made by Reb David HaNagid. I don't think he appreciated that the person making the glosses was someone who, A, was a tremendous scholar himself, and B, was somebody that likely had access to the original and was comparing it against the original. So he felt that, if this Magia, this editor, took such liberties with the text, it's probably a very corrupt text, and he felt free to take as many liberties as can. Again, with the purest academic standard, he doesn't just change the text without telling you, but he felt it perfectly within his right to add as many insertions as he saw fit, provided that he would be able to. It's an act of genius on his part. He would only add in addition if he could make that the first letter of his addition would be the same as the first letter of where the text resumes, so that he could say that it's likely that the scribe skipped from this letter to the next letter. There's a complicated Latin word for such a omission, but a scribal omission. So he would insert that, and every time he would add in a word, he would make sure that the first letter of his Arabic text would be the same as where the text does resume after his brackets, or sometimes the last letter of it would fit with the last letter. In some cases, he managed to do both. It's an act of genius, but it's totally unbased and unfounded. I've found in further manuscripts of Reb David HaNagid where he quotes from this Pirush that he had. I mentioned earlier that it's almost never cited. The only person who does cite it is this Reb David HaNagid. Reb David HaNagid, when he quotes from this Pirush that he had in hand, he quotes it in his other glosses. He always quotes it exactly the way we have it. L'rabbis chaseris v'yaseris. If the word is missing a letter, which Wiesenberg thought he should add in, it's Reb David HaNagid quotes it exactly the way we have it. So it's chazu my gav rabbi b'kamasad alei. Reb David HaNagid felt that this is an accurate text. I said, who are we to change it? So I tried as much as I can to restore the text. If I couldn't read it without Wiesenberg's addition, I left it in there. If I felt it added, I left it in there. But wherever I could, I tried to go without them. So my text, I believe, is much cleaner. Again, it might be complicated, but I think it's still it's a more faithful representation of the original, and it's also much easier to read. I don't want to sound like I'm casting any aspersions on the scholarship of Rabbi Wiesenberg. He was an amazing scholar. His work is amazing. His notes are a different style. They're not user friendly at all. He's very concerned with textual issues. So I've preserved what I could from his notes in my notes, but I've always expanded them and made them much more user friendly. So his he definitely deserves credit for his contribution. I just felt there was room to build on what he did, and I think I've done the best I can at this point.
I think in introduction you read it's like a number, it's like spotted. So I think you did a better job, but I will just say one slight criticism, but not much you could do about it, as you explained. It also has a bunch of different parentheses, brackets, different text, big, small. Like you explained, there's nothing you could do. You fixed it up. But
what I could do is, if I was making my own text and starting from fresh, like again, if I was doing an English edition, so then I would translate in a way which would obviate the need for all these insertions. But again, I wanted to preserve the text except for where I was fixing the translation, and that's why I did the best I can within the parameters that I set out for myself. Again, it may not ultimately be the best approach, but I felt that this is the best way to go about it for where I was, and that's what I've done.
Right. I think the only thing that I would point out maybe in the next edition, which we'll get to, the next edition of this would maybe be like right on that first page within, there's like a legend, just because it's in the introduction, but it's hard to see. A lot of times those Seforim, they have, this font is this, and this is this,
That's
this,
a very good idea.
Just putting it as like a box, someone could just quickly flip to and reference it. Oh, okay, what's going on? What's where? Something like that. But it is very, very nice for those that are not familiar that can see it. Okay, so let's, you mentioned Reb David HaNagid. Let's talk about something before we get back to just finally discussing this. What you're working on now, and you just wrote an article in Mechilta, the 4th edition of the Mechilta Journal. Those that are not familiar with, we can really, I guess, save that for a future episode to discuss specifically. But maybe you want to mention that or anything else you're working on.
Yeah, sure. Reb David HaNagid, this last Reb David the second Nagid, Reb David the son of Rabbi Yehoshua Nagid, he left behind besides for all the manuscripts that he learned and left behind and commented on, he wrote a number of his own Seforim. One of the Seforim he wrote was a Pirush on Chumash. Now this Pirush on Chumash did not survive in its entirety, but from the fragments we have, we can see it was quite a rich Pirush in its citations of sources which are long lost, in its Girsais are of course important. And so one such fragment is the one I published in the Mechilta Journal. There's hopefully more. I've been mining other fragments for citations of Avraham Ben HaRambam, who he does quote in this Pirush. When I first found these manuscripts, which are available online at the JNUL website, in their earlier website, they did not say whose Pirush this was. They just said this is the fragment that I published. They said it was a philosophical Pirush on Shemois. And when I was looking through the Pirush, and I noticed a quotation from Avraham Ben HaRambam, but it was prefaced by Reish Aleph Beis Hey Hey, and I was like, who's that? And then I figured, that's Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam HaMoira, and I checked it, and it was consistent. So I figured out who it was. I said, who had this Pirush? It must be Reb David HaNagid. And then, sure enough, at a later stage, the JNUL updated its website with more information from with input from various scholars and librarians, and they said it's assumed, it's not definite, that this might be a sefer written by Reb David HaNagid. I was able to verify that, and that's the piece that I published. But I've continued to mine, the other unpublished fragments for more citations of Avraham Ben HaRambam, and I think I found a few more that can help fill in the missing part, as I mentioned earlier. What's important in this context is getting back to I said about almost nobody quoting the sefer. Someone brought to my attention that Chuvas Radvaz, Reb David ben Zimra from Mitzrayim in the 1600s, the late 1500s. He does quote Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam in one of the in the most recently published volume, the 8th volume, which is from manuscript. He does quote from the Pirush, and to me that was astounding because I didn't know that anyone ever had the Pirush. As far as I know, only Reb David HaNagid had it. But once I've discovered this sefer from Reb David HaNagid's own Pirush on Chumash, which quotes Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam, and it seems likely to me that will solve this problem as well. That probably it's from Reb David HaNagid's sefer, which Reb David says he did send to his friends in Mitzrayim. He did disseminate it some. That's probably where the Radvaz first came to see this, not from the original Pirush.
Okay, so like I said, hopefully we can discuss that. But for Parashas Ve'era, that article that you just, and then that piece from the David Nugget just published, is there any other projects that you're working on now?
I touched a lot of fragments in the, a lot of Geniza fragments. The Geniza is so searchable now with the Friedberg Geniza project, and a tremendous debt of gratitude is owed to Dov Friedberg, what he has done. First of all, I was able to learn the Judeo-Arabic of the Pirush from the, part of his portal is a Judeo-Arabic corpus. And you can search it, it's digital, you can search any word and forms and roots. And so that was immeasurably helpful, as well as the main part of this website is the digitalization of all the Geniza fragments. So I was able to use Geniza fragments to supplement sometimes Rabbi Chananel ben Shmuel's Pirush, the father-in-law that we mentioned earlier. So I was able to find previously unknown pieces of the Sefer HaMaspik. I found one piece where he quotes his Pirush on Chumash. That's how I figured out, this must be Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam, because he quotes a Pirush that he says in Parashas Yisro. I brought this to the attention of Professor Friedman, and Professor Friedman wrote a whole article of it where he thanks me for bringing this, for identifying this fragment and bringing it to his attention. So, there's a lot of other such fragments which I felt that it's a shame to leave them languishing. I used what I could in the notes, so I want to go back and particularly the pieces of the Sefer HaMaspik and maybe Rabeinu Chananel ben Shmuel's own Pirush. I have that in mind. I've done some rudimentary work on that. I want to use that, and I envision perhaps putting a supplementary volume on Chumash from all the fragments from David and from Chananel and pieces from the Maspik, and maybe as a supplement. And this might encompass more than just Bereishis Shemais. This might also, if I include the Chuvas of Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam and parts of the Sefer HaMaspik where he talks about it, might, a volume that would cover commentary on of Tanakh from this school.
Okay, so I will put links on where to purchase Bereishis Shemais and the Haggados. But let's talk about: are you looking to do a new edition now, or you printed these a while ago? Are there not many more copies left around?
There's almost nothing left. I have almost none myself, and in my inventory, the Seforim stores may have some. If you can get it, great. But we're almost done. Baruch Hashem, it's really been very well received. I have not had to worry about them. They were chopped up with, and the feedback has been tremendous. It's been very positive. Thanks, Nachi, for your help. So Baruch Hashem, we're almost sold out. And to put a new edition, I don't want to just reprint it. I've had so many people have brought the comments, clarifications, and corrections. So I've got a file with about about 100 corrections on each and additions for each of these each sefer. So I feel like I really want, if I'm going to do it again, I want to make a revised edition, which is expensive. So I don't know how fast I'll be able to do that. It's a kind of a lot of authors have this. They don't to reprint is easy and cheap, but once they've had additional material, they don't want to just do a reprint. So we're not sure. And again, another plan also is an English translation, which would enable me to be more, to implement the kind of text that I would like, which may be much more user friendly as well.
Okay, so if anybody wants to help out with the slightly revised new edition, or like I said in English, they can email you mbamaimon@gmail.com. It's in the Sefer. I'll put it in the show's notes so anyone can help out financially, can email you about that. I do want to mention one final thing. I know that was supposed to be the final thing, but one final thing I forgot, that you do have a number of haskamas in the Bereishis and the Shemais edition. Do you want to mention those? Who you got those from? And how you decided to go about this.
Yeah, the Bereshis one, I was learning. I was in Lakewood Yeshiva's Koilel, so I went, of course, to the Rosh Yeshiva, to Malkiel, went to Hifar Haskama. I went to. I felt, I felt Reb David Cohen. I had seen that he has an interest in Rishonim. He has an interest in Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam. I had gone to him. I felt Reb Shmuel Kamenetsky would be a good Haskam because my father is learned by Reb Shmuel, and I had spoken to Reb Shmuel, and he was very warm and friendly. So I got from Reb Shmuel as well. And then I felt just for the family connection, my grandfather, I would have loved to have a letter there for my grandfather, but my grandfather passed away as the Sefer was nearing completion, and he was always very interested in the project, and in a way the Sefer is a dedication to his memory. So my father's organization, it's a shul and a publishing company that's named for my grandfather. So it's published under the auspices of this organization. So my father provided a letter, and then I felt the oldest rabbinical member of our family is Rav Chaim Ben Eliel. I asked him also to grace it with a haskama. I didn't really want to go shopping around for haskamas, but these I felt is appropriate. So I went to them for haskamas. After the Sefer was published, there was very warm feedback. Rav Yankel Drillman reached out to me. He loved the Sefer. He offered to write haskama. My Rosh Yeshiva, where I had learned in Edison Yeshiva, Rabbi Yosef Eichenstein offered to write haskama. Another one of my Rebbeim, Rav Meir Mazuz, who I'd sent this Seforim to, he sent in a letter. Rav Yitzchak Shilat was very grateful, when I had sent him the Sefer, and he was happy to write haskama. So those haskamas are more feedback from the original Sefer, but I think they do add to the color and dimension of the readership of the Sefer. I think it shows the level of appreciation. The second, Bereshit, which had sold out right away, so I did issue a smaller run, a revised copy, and then the Edison Yeshiva, which is the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School, they offered to subsidize the new prints, and that's why then it says on the title page Rabbi Jacob Joseph School Press, and I'm very grateful to them as well for their help, and of course I owe them a great deal of gratitude for my intellectual growth and development over the years.
Okay, very good. And for those that aren't familiar with how the Sefer looks, by the way, for those maybe some are familiar with the more famous Schwartz edition of Ma'amar Al HaAggados, 2 volumes with the blue, and it has the picture in the front. Like you mentioned, we discussed how the Rambam, we have his own handwriting, one of the few Rishonim. Avraham is the same way. So you have the front cover is a fragment with his own handwriting, and it's signed off, Avraham Ben Moshe.
Yes. I thought that was a very beautiful touch. Like you mentioned, the Schwartz Rambam, I wanted something that looks like that. I wanted a Sefer that looks like it's worthy of holding the very, very chashuv Sefer, and that's why we settled on a very unique design, which does mirror the Schwartz edition a lot. And I think it's a great feature, the added facsimile of Rabbi Avraham Ben HaRambam's own handwriting. I think it gives it a very personal touch. Yeah, and this is all done beautifully by Rabbi Shemanowitz from Ali Zayas. I had a very good experience working with them and publishing the Sefer. They're very helpful and very professional, and they do fantastic, beautiful work.
I was going to say we need to mention Shimi. I know he won't be happy if I don't mention him. So we should mention him. And he did a really nice job. And the cover, like you said, the whole cover, the design looks really nice. It looks very, prestige. I don't know what the right word is. And the inside also, a lot of the different things that were
beautiful. I believe it's very befitting to have a nice keli for the beautiful Torah in there. And Baruch Hashem, the feedback concurs. Everybody I speak to, they tell me how wonderful it looks, and I had such a nice experience working with a company that I eventually joined the company, and now I work for Ali Zayas as well. So kudos to Shimon for a fantastic job and a wonderful company as well.
Yeah, full disclosure, right? Okay, so that's that. So like I said, anyone interested in purchasing a copy, I'll put up links. It is available in various farm stores. Mizrahi has it. New, he's not selling a used. He has some new, he sells new farms also. It's there. I don't know how many are still available, but it could still be in farms. Or if I find a link, I'll try to put it up. But anyone interested in helping out financially for new edition can email Moshe. And also, I know this is a long episode, but there's a lot more that we didn't get to hear. There are some overarching themes that we can discuss, Maimonidean themes.
There's a lot of Ma'amar Nevuchim. I got a real education in Ma'amar Nevuchim working on the Sefer. I constantly go through it and break my teeth figuring out the more esoteric parts. I've read up as much as I can on anything to do with the Rambam and the Ma'amar Nevuchim and his shita and his parshanas and his philosophy. So I've really got to, working on this has been a real period of growth for me as well. We couldn't do a lot of that, in this kind of general discussion, but the notes do, I believe, will give you a very good feel for general Maimonidean studies.
Okay, so we can, we can definitely do another episode if those are interested. Please email me, letting me know that you would like to hear Moshe again come on to talk about these things. You enjoyed this episode, let me know. And as always, Moshe, thank you for joining me on the podcast again.
Thank you very much, Nahi. It was always a great pleasure. Wish you a good night and all your listeners as well. Hatzlach and everything. It's an amazing privilege to be able to spend time with you and talking about things that we love.
Thank you.